Welcome to Cheating Tales Diary. Before we dive into today's story, we have a humble request. Please consider subscribing to this new channel. Help us hit our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your support will motivate us to keep bringing you more exclusive original cheating wife stories. And now, let's get started with today's story. Dan Armstrong always believed that life was about honesty, hard work, and the quiet moments shared under a solid roof. In the freezing winters of Cedar Creek, Wisconsin, when snow crusted the rooftops of the town, Dan's work began. He was a low-profile but well-known roofer in the area. His days revolved around the scent of asphalt shingles, the feel of aluminum ladders, and the carefully arranged tools in the back of his work van. At 37, Dan thought he had built a good life. A stable job, a modest home, and a beautiful wife he'd known since their college days. Jenna Armstrong, 34, was an ambitious and magnetic sales manager for a wellness and skincare brand called NatraGlow. She traveled often. Client meetings, retreats, and brand energy conferences took her across the country. Dan never paid much attention to her field, but he always trusted her. When she returned from trips, her suitcase would spill out herbal teas, lavender sachets, and silky lingerie. Dan would just smile. Her world's different, he'd tell himself, but she's mine. But slowly, something started to shift. Jenna's so-called girls' trips began happening more frequently. What used to be twice a year turned into every other month, and always the same pattern. A Friday night flight, returning Monday evening. Dan didn't think much of it at first. But one Saturday morning, while digging around in the basement for old tiles, he found something that rattled him. In a black box under a white blanket was a silver zip bag. Inside was a full-body latex suit, slate gray, zipped all the way to the neck, with strange perforated holes across it. Dan froze. What the hell is this? He considered asking Jenna right away, but stopped himself. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was looking at. That evening, over dinner, Dan brought it up casually. Hey, I saw something in your suitcase. Some kind of weird suit? Is it a uniform for work or something? Jenna's face lost color for just a split second. Then, quickly recovering, she smiled and said, "Oh, that? It's a Halloween thing. Mindy packed it in as a joke. Totally forgot it was in there." Dan chuckled along, but something didn't sit right. The next day, when he went back to the basement, the suit was gone. He didn't bring it up again. But from that point on, something inside him refused to rest. He started watching Jenna more closely. How she smiled, how she kissed him goodbye, how she barely touched her dinner. A few days later, Jenna announced another trip, this time to Sedona, Arizona, for an energy rebalancing retreat. Dan nodded like always, but there was doubt in his eyes now. Deep, silent doubt. The moment Jenna left, Dan went searching. In a drawer, buried under spare chargers, was her old phone. The one she'd forgotten to take. It wasn't locked. No suspicious texts. But one note stood out in the Notes app. Arrival time 7:45 p.m. Wear plain dress. Locker 14. Passcode Belladonna. Dan's chest tightened. That didn't sound like a spa retreat. That night, he sat in the dark, gripping his old leather tool belt. He thought about roofing. How every nail, every seal had to be placed with intention, with patience, or else the whole roof could leak. Now he had to apply the same precision. Not to a roof, but to his life. To his truth. The next morning, Dan called an old friend, Jake Coleman, who used to work for a company that sold surveillance gear. "You still got those pen cameras and micro GPS trackers?" Dan asked. Jake paused. "Who are you tracking?" Dan's voice was quiet. "My wife." There was a long silence. Then Jake said, "All right. But Dan, once you go looking for the truth, there's no easy way back. Dan didn't smile. His lips were tight, his jaw set. All he could think was, what kind of life is she living that I don't know about? That same night, Dan installed a GPS tracker under Jenna's SUV. In the corner of their bedroom, just beneath the smoke detector, he hid a mini camera that recorded every movement. And then, the waiting began. Dan Armstrong's life split into two halves. The one he showed the world, and the one he now lived in secret. By day, he was still the hard-working roofer, driving his van, fixing roofs, nodding to neighbors. By night, he was a silent observer, watching hours of surveillance footage, decoding his marriage. The GPS tracker became his new confidant. Every beep on the screen told a story. A wellness trip that started in Wisconsin and ended at a luxury resort in Michigan. Another that took a detour into an industrial warehouse district in Chicago. Yet Jenna always used the same cover. Wellness, healing, self-care. Dan added 2 more hidden mics in the house, one in her dressing room, one inside the living room flower vase. Now every phone call, every apology, every slip of the tongue was his to record. At home, Jenna still smiled. She still asked, "Should I make turkey tonight? Or salmon?" And Dan still said, "Whatever you like." But inside, he had changed. He was no longer just a husband. He had become a witness to a marriage that looked perfect on the outside but was crumbling from within. One evening, while Jenna was away again, Dan finally sat down and combed through 2 weeks of camera footage. The first few days showed nothing unusual. Jenna on calls, Jenna sipping coffee, Jenna chatting with her friend Mindy. But then, one clip made him stop breathing. In the footage, Jenna stood in front of the mirror. She wore a white silk gown. In her hands, the same latex suit he'd found weeks earlier. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a soft smile on her lips, she whispered, "They always want perfection. I am the product." Dan turned up the audio, but the rest of her words were too faint to make out. Only one name came through clearly. Jonquil. He had never heard that name before. It wasn't one of her friends, not a family member. Dan searched online. He combed through social media. Nothing. Just the name. Hanging there. Echoing. Like the first drop before a storm. That same week, Jenna said she had to attend a 3-day women's retreat at a place called Emerald Valley. Dan nodded in agreement, but this time there was a faint smile on his face, because along with the tracker, he had installed a high-fidelity voice recorder in Jenna's car, one that could capture every call, every conversation, and every lie. Dan called Jake Coleman, a man who had spent a decade in surveillance. Jake showed him a small black device. With this, you can scan her SUV from up to 200 meters away. Voice, text, even shallow vibrations, it can detect everything. Dan asked, "And the camera?" Jake said, "You don't need a camera. You need someone to shadow her, and I need the person who's been shadowing my wife." Dan was stunned. "What do you mean?" Jake paused for a moment, then said, "My wife Lisa also goes on these trips with Jenna. And I've been doing the same thing you're doing." Both men went silent for a few seconds, as if the weight of betrayal had fallen on both of their shoulders at the exact same moment. Dan took a deep breath. "We go together. This time, we don't back down." They decided that on the next trip, they would follow in an unmarked car and find out where these women were really going. On the third day, at 7:30 a.m., Jenna and Lisa loaded their suitcases into a black SUV and left. Dan and Jake followed them in a brown Chevy Impala. No headlights, no radio. The entire drive was silent. Only the blinking GPS light and the sound of heavy breathing inside the car. The SUV exited off Interstate 43 and turned onto a dirt road. No signage, and the GPS mapping suddenly froze. Jake said softly, "We're off the grid." Dan looked out the window. A wild road ran between trees, the soil still wet from rain. The SUV's tire tracks were clearly visible. 10 minutes later, a dense forest began. But in the middle stood a steel gate, with no markings, no board. The gate was open, and the SUV had already entered. Dan stopped the car there. Jake said, "From here, we go on foot." They tightened their jackets, checked their camera lens bracelets, and moved forward cautiously through the thick woods, staying hidden. After half an hour of trekking, what they saw made their hair stand on end. A lavish mansion with a black glass dome on its roof, surveillance towers on all sides, and two men standing at the door, dressed in military tactical gear but without any insignia. Dan pulled out his binoculars. He saw Jenna, Lisa, and 4 other women exit the SUV, entering one by one. All their faces were expressionless, as if this wasn't a retreat, but a programmed submission. Jake said, "We're standing at the doorstep of a cult, brother, and our wives are inside." Dan clenched his fists. Backing out is no longer an option. As Dan and Jake stayed hidden in the bushes, watching that strange mansion, time seemed to freeze. This wasn't an ordinary house. The decor, the security system, and the unsettling silence told a very different story. This place wasn't just about money. It was a game of power and control. Jenna and Lisa had already gone inside. Along with them were 4 other women, all roughly between the ages of 30 and 40, but it didn't look like they were preparing for any corporate summit. It looked more like some secret ritual. They were all wearing slim-fit dresses, their faces expressionless, and one by one, they entered through a large door that 2 bulky guards opened. The mansion's exterior surveillance cameras kept rotating, but one detail stood out. The cameras were monitoring from the outside in, as if the purpose was to make sure that what was happening inside didn't come out. Dan and Jake were now fully alert. They spotted an old, abandoned shed around 300 meters from the mansion. Behind it was a trail that led directly to a service entry. They decided to wait until nightfall, and once the light was low, they would attempt to sneak in through that service entry. Night deepened, and the sounds of insects in the forest grew louder, but no sound came from the mansion. Around 9:45 p.m., a blacked-out van entered through the main gate. The driver was masked, and from the back seat, 2 men stepped out, dressed in suits, their faces also covered. They were carrying black briefcases. Dan looked through the binoculars and saw something deeply disturbing. A woman, possibly Jenna, was standing in the hallway, now wearing a deep blue latex corset. In her hands was a file, which she handed over to the men in suits. One of them reached out and touched her face. And Jenna didn't react. No recoil, no hesitation, just a robotic stillness. Jake's breathing grew heavy. "Lisa, she must be doing the same," he whispered. Dan's fists were trembling, but deviating from the plan was no longer an option. Around midnight, they rubbed mud over their clothes for camouflage, identified the surveillance blind spots, and slowly approached the mansion's side using the service trail. One window was left open, maybe by mistake, maybe by a careless service worker. Dan pulled a rope from his belt, extended a pipe-mounted camera through the opening, and what he saw sliced through his soul. Inside the hallway, women were standing in a line, all dressed in latex outfits, their faces blank, emotionless. One by one, they were being led into a small room. From inside came muted music and a low, monotonous voice, like someone chanting a ritual. Dan pushed the camera a little further in. There was a large projector screen with words displayed. Jonquil Ascension, Session number 27, Obedience Through Silence. Now Dan was sure. This wasn't a wellness retreat. It was a well-organized cult, and his wife was part of it. Jake whispered in his ear, Our job is to collect footage. We get out of here as soon as possible. There's nothing we can do right now. Dan was breaking apart inside, but he knew Jake was right. He couldn't pull his wife out. Not now, not like this. They quietly retreated, but on their way back, they stumbled on something new. Behind the mansion stood a truck with a logo that read, Circle Safe Logistics. A name Dan had never heard before, but its emblem was all too familiar. It was the same circle, 3 overlapping rings that Jenna wore around her neck. What once seemed like a spiritual symbol now looked like the insignia of a secret organization. They took a photo of the truck's license plate and noted other surveillance details. The next morning, Dan and Jake checked into a secure motel and sent all the footage to Marcus, Dan's old friend who had once served in special ops and now worked in private investigations. Marcus's reply came quickly. These aren't small players. This is deep asset trafficking, identity reconditioning, and psychological suppression programs. Your wives, they may not be here against their will anymore. They might be voluntary participants, but we still have time. I'll go inside. Dan asked, how? Marcus said, let me be the next recruit. Marcus Belmont never thought he'd have to prepare for a tactical infiltration again. Not in civilian life. Afghanistan's covert ops had hardened him, but this wasn't a battlefield. This was psychological warfare. A silent penetration of a network where bullets didn't matter, but mind control did. Dan and Jake gave him everything: footage, documents, and the Circle Safe logistics truck info. Marcus made his plan: infiltrate Jonquil Ascension from the inside. But he wouldn't enter as an agent or a soldier. He'd go in as a client, a willing male candidate. He built a new identity: Ethan Vellum, a retired financial analyst suffering from burnout and emotional collapse. He scanned dark web forums, tracing the access points Jonquil Circle used to filter new applicants. Finally, he found a hidden portal, invite only, which presented him with a psychological intake survey. Do you seek control or surrender? Have you ever loved someone so much you'd reshape yourself for them? Would you agree to pain in pursuit of peace? Each question was a psychological hook, carefully designed to test pliability. Marcus answered thoughtfully, building the profile of a broken man looking for meaning. Within 48 hours, an encrypted email arrived. You have been observed. Your silence has value. Attached was a PDF with the interview location, dress code, gray formal attire, no phone, no jewelry, and arrival time. Tuesday, 11:15 p.m. Marcus briefed Dan and Jake on the plan. A button camera was sewn into his suit. A miniature audio relay was hidden inside his belt. A panic tap alert system was strapped to his wrist. Dan would monitor the feed live from a discreet van parked nearby. On Tuesday night, Marcus arrived at the mansion's black gate in his gray suit, face calm, demeanor centered. The guard at the gate confirmed his name and escorted him inside. The interior was unlike anything he expected. Deep wine-colored walls, dim ambient lighting, and the scent of frankincense hanging thick in the air. A long corridor led him to a room where 3 individuals sat waiting. A woman checking marks on a clipboard, a man glancing repeatedly at his watch, and a third person, staring directly into Marcus's eyes. The questions began, but they weren't job interview questions. Do you believe in the erasure of identity as a form of freedom? Have you ever tasted silence that wasn't yours? Would you sacrifice what you built for what you never had? Marcus answered each one slowly, like a man desperate to lose himself, to disappear. Subtle changes passed across the interviewers' faces. He was fitting the mold. Then came the final line. Not a question, but a declaration. Welcome to Jonquil Phase 1. Remove your name. You are now Ember 11. Marcus was handed a gray briefcase. Inside was a plain latex uniform, a compact dietary pack, and a digital token with the ID, M11-JQ27. He was instructed to stay the night. A narrow hallway led him to a room with a soft blue hue. Inside were 4 others, 3 women, 1 man, all expressionless, all silent. Marcus sat among them. He watched. He listened. He observed every breath, every still movement. And he realized these people were no longer just participants. They were completely under the cult's command. The next morning, they were taken to the Ascension Chamber, a massive circular hall where the walls were engraved with the symbol of 3 overlapping rings. At the center stood a raised circular platform surrounded by transparent booths, each one hosting a ritual in progress. Dan and Jake were in the truck's surveillance van at the time, watching the live feed. Dan's eyes never left the camera screen. And then suddenly, he saw her. Jenna, in a latex robe, now hairless, even her eyebrows gone, stood inside one of the booths. In front of her were 3 masked men and 1 woman, conducting a devotion test. Jenna extended her hands and, in a calm, robotic voice, said, "I am no one. I am product. I am discipline. I erase for elevation." Dan's heart sank. That wasn't Jenna. That was someone else now. Marcus recorded everything, the rituals, the behavioral response drills, even the grooming of newcomers. In another booth, he spotted Lisa. Her condition was the same. Her eyes were empty. Her smile held a mechanical tension. At 1 a.m., Marcus was taken into a room and interrogated by a woman, his assigned handler, Mistress Kira. She asked, "Why did you come here?" Marcus answered, "Because the noise broke me. I want the silence now." Kira smiled faintly. "Then make yourself worthy. Phase 2 begins tomorrow." Marcus had now been pulled deeper inside, and his mission was becoming real. Everything Dan and Jake had seen so far was just the surface. But at the heart of this cult pulsed something far darker: obedience-based ownership. A system where a person erases their name, desires, relationships, and past, all to adopt one identity, Jonquil Circle. Marcus sent his first encrypted note to Dan, just a single line. They erase names, desires, and past. Jenna's gone. Only Ember 9 remains. 4 days after Marcus went inside Jonquil, Dan and Jake hadn't received any direct contact from him since that last message. The camera feed had suddenly gone dark, possibly signal jammed, or maybe Marcus's surveillance gear had been detected. They were nervous, but by now they had seen enough. Jenna and Lisa's presence, their reconditioning, and their new Ember identities. They understood that what they had seen was only a scratch on the surface. The truth beneath was darker, deeper, and far more dangerous. Dan decided they needed to return to the estate and attempt to trace the signal. They used the same old path: dense forest, muddy trails, and previously abandoned surveillance blind spots. But this time, something had changed. The surveillance zones had expanded. A new black SUV had been parked behind the trees since noon, and it looked like their every move was being tracked. Dan and Jake made it to a service garage near the southern corner of the mansion. That's where they picked up a faint encrypted radio signal. Marcus's panic code. Just 3 dots. Then a long beep. It was a code Marcus had taught them beforehand. It meant, "Trapped, but alive." Dan's heartbeat quickened. Jake said, "That means he's been caught, and he might still have some data left." Just then, a sharp noise ripped through the forest's silence. 2 masked men, in full tactical gear, jumped out in front of them. Before Dan could process anything, something heavy struck his head. Everything went black. When Dan woke up, his eyes were burning. He and Jake were inside a pitch-black room, metal walls, ice cold, and a single bulb flickering above them. Their wrists were zip-tied. In front of them was a long steel table. Across the table sat a man, wearing a black carbon mask, night vision lenses over his eyes. He didn't introduce himself. He simply spoke in a cold, calm voice. "Mr. Armstrong, roofer by profession, you built trust for a living, but trust breaks." Dan said nothing. The man gestured toward Jake. "And your friend, the one with a wife who bends to command, you two should have stayed broken." He tossed a USB drive on the table. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? Partial footage, limited audio, just enough to make you obsessed, but never confident." Dan asked quietly, "Marcus?" The masked man lowered his head. "He broke protocol. We reprogram, or we discard." Dan's eyes stung. Tears began to form. He couldn't even imagine what Marcus was going through. The masked figure stood up and said, "Here's how this ends. You go home. You forget your wives. You disappear. Or we erase you." Moments later, they were sedated again, until they lost consciousness. When Dan and Jake woke up again, they were lying on the side of a desolate Wisconsin highway. Blood on their faces, the USB still in Dan's pocket, and a single card next to them. "Jonquil sees you. Now walk away." When they returned home, Dan immediately connected the USB to a secure, isolated network and analyzed the contents. The footage was incomplete, but it was revealing. A short clip from Marcus's torture room, his eyes swollen, his voice weak, looking into the camera and whispering, "Phase 3 is ownership. They sell compliance-ready identities to global buyers." Another clip showed Jenna inside a small interview booth, wearing a latex mask, speaking slowly. "I remember Daniel. He fixed roofs. But here, I was rebuilt." Dan's soul trembled. This wasn't personal anymore. This was a global psychological slavery operation, crafted for elite clients. The cult was only a cover. The true goal was to manufacture obedient, erased, reprogrammable individuals, trained for emotionless tasks, detached from any identity. Jake was shattered. After seeing Lisa like that, he had lost all faith in law, in justice. Dan said, "We'll never have peace now, but there's one thing we can do. Expose them." Jake looked at him. "You'll lose everything." Dan replied, "I've already lost everything. What's left, I save for someone else." Dan Armstrong and Jake Coleman had returned home. Their bodies bruised, blood dried around their eyes, but their minds sharper than ever. They now had proof. Incomplete, yes, but enough to peek into the cracks of something horrifying. Marcus's tortured confession, Jenna and Lisa's erased identities, and a deep cult infrastructure that had turned human beings into products. Dan now understood. His marriage hadn't been built on love and memories, but on a protocol, a controlled experiment. Dan contacted his old military contact, Spencer Lawton, now working as an underground journalist. One look at Spencer, and it was clear he was Dan's last hope. Spencer believed in exposing the truth, but he had one condition. "If we publish this footage, your life will become hell. Your name, your face. Everything will be a target." Dan replied, "Let them come. They already erased her. What else is left to fear?" Spencer drafted an outline for a documentary. The Obedience Industry, Inside America's Silent Cults. And that same night, editing began. But one confrontation still remained, with Jenna. Dan called her, his voice calm, as if calling an old friend. "Come home, Jenna," he said. "I won't ask anything, just come." Jenna arrived 2 days later in a gray sedan. No makeup, hair perfectly straight, eyes hollow. She opened the door and stepped inside the living room, standing still, like she was staring at artifacts in a museum that once held meaning. Dan showed no anger. Pouring whiskey at the counter, he said, "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" Jenna said nothing. He continued, "You told me I love stability. I love the feeling of being known. Do you still want that?" Jenna took a deep breath. "I don't know what I want anymore. They took that part of me and replaced it with silence." Dan pulled out his phone and played the footage, the one where Jenna says, "I am no one. I am product." For a split second, pain passed across Jenna's face. Then she whispered, "They made me say it." Again and again, until I forgot what I actually sounded like. Dan asked, "So what are you now?" Jenna replied, "I'm scared and empty, but part of me remembers you, the way you looked at me the first time I cried." Dan looked at her, the woman who was still his wife, but no longer his. "You said something to me the first time you broke down. Don't ever let me disappear." Dan's voice trembled. "But you did, Jenna. You disappeared." Jenna's eyes welled up, but there was no guilt, just a deep, fragile brokenness. Dan said, "I don't want a divorce. I don't want anything from you, but I have to show the world what's happening to women like you. I'm not ending this story. I'm opening it." Jenna looked at him, really looked, for the first time. She spoke softly. "Then use me." Dan was taken aback. "What?" Jenna opened her palm. Inside was a pendant with the 3 overlapping circles. "It has a transmitter. It used to send my body's signals to the circle. It was their leash. But maybe now, it can become my confession." Dan took the pendant, as if someone had just placed the final key to the truth in his hands. The next day, Dan and Spencer released the first draft of the documentary online. With Marcus's incomplete footage, Jenna's interview clip, and internal jonquil recordings showing masked patrons and obedience rituals, the video went viral overnight. Across Reddit, X, and TruthLeak, the hashtag number JonquilTruth began trending. Dozens of women started sending DMS with confessions. Some said they'd also been put through obedience reprogramming. Others revealed their boyfriends had tried to enroll them into the cult. But as fast as the truth spread, Jonquil Circle responded even faster. A black car started parking outside Dan's house. On some nights, the mailbox would be open, with nothing inside except a white card. "Stay silent. Stay alive." Jake's email was hacked. His workplace came under private surveillance. Spencer told Dan, "This is war now, but your truth is louder than their threats." Later that same week, Jenna filed an affidavit in court, presenting herself as a victim of Jonquil Circle, confessing she had been psychologically manipulated into a consensual slavery model. In the courtroom, Dan and Jenna stood across from each other, not as enemies, but as survivors trying to break down a fortress built from silence. Dan testified, "My wife was brainwashed. I lost her, but I'm not here to get her back. I'm here so no other husband loses his wife like this." The judge ordered Jenna into monitored psychiatric treatment and escalated the Jonquil Circle case to a federal-level investigation. Dan walked out of the courtroom, Jenna's pendant in his hand. He handed it to a reporter. "This isn't just a symbol anymore. It's proof of how a system quietly erases identities." Dan and Jenna Armstrong's marriage now existed only on paper, legally intact, but emotionally long dead. But the moment Jenna filed her affidavit in court, Dan realized this was no longer just their story. It was the story of anyone who had been quietly chained into mental servitude without ever being touched. He no longer saw himself as just a husband. He was a witness. A witness to a carefully engineered injustice that thrived silently inside homes, behind teacups, between bedtime conversations. Jenna was ordered by the court into psychiatric rehabilitation, placed at a state-certified trauma recovery center where she would undergo monitored sessions and deconditioning therapy. But Dan never visited. He didn't go to see her, speak to her, or hear her voice. In his eyes, She was no longer the wife who once ran into his arms after coming back from a trip. She was a fragmented persona, reshaped using someone else's blueprint. Meanwhile, Jake had filed for divorce from Lisa. But his battle was more complex. Lisa submitted a statement in court claiming Jake was abusive, controlling, and paranoid, and that he was the reason she ended up in the cult. Jake was shaken, but Spencer and Dan testified on his behalf, presenting surveillance footage, videos of Lisa's participation in circle events, and Marcus's transcribed notes. Everything was laid out in front of the court. But Jonquil Circle's legal defense was surprisingly strong. A high-profile law firm, Larch and Denning, represented them, arguing that every interaction had been consensual and that this was no cult, but a psycho-spiritual sovereign group where participants chose to undergo psychological rebirth. Dan was on the witness stand when the defense attorney asked, "Mr. Armstrong, isn't it true that your wife willingly participated in these activities without any documented coercion?" Dan looked him directly in the eye. Coercion isn't always documented. Sometimes, it's whispered into your soul while you're asleep. The courtroom went dead silent. In the ruling, the judge granted Jenna limited immunity and ordered that she be placed under witness protection-style monitoring on the basis that her mental conditioning was medically validated. Dan was awarded a share of spousal financial compensation, but he declined any alimony. "I don't want her money," he told the judge. "I wanted her freedom, and she gave it to me." Lisa's case was different. Footage presented by Jake showed how Lisa had personally fed information to Jonquil handlers. Dan and Jake's movements, addresses, weaknesses. This betrayal was no longer marital. It crossed into criminal intent. Lisa was found guilty of obstruction of investigation and aiding in psychological entrapment. But thanks to Jonquil's legal protections, she was also sent to rehabilitation instead of prison. Dan and Jake walked out of court, with no real definition of victory. There were no trophies waiting for them at home. Only the final scream of dead relationships, now sealed in court records. Dan turned to Jake and asked, "Did we survive?" Jake took a long breath. "We're broken, but we're still here. And that's what scares them the most, that we can still speak." That night, Dan began the process of selling his old home. The one where life used to tick like a perfectly wound clock until it suddenly stopped. But before leaving it behind, he did one last thing. He found Marcus's family. He handed Marcus's mother an encrypted drive. It contained all of Marcus's surveillance notes, a brief video confession, and a handwritten letter from Dan. "Your son didn't vanish. He infiltrated something the world is still blind to. He tried to bring them down. This is what's left of his light." Marcus was officially declared dead, though no body was ever found. Dan didn't know for sure. Maybe Marcus had died. Or maybe he had been absorbed into another name, another identity. Spencer's documentary began circulating across platforms like Newsline and Exposure Watch. 2 U.S. Senate subcommittees opened investigations into the Jonquil Circle, but the legal layers protecting the organization were so deep, progress was slow and vague. Dan was ready to keep fighting, but rising above courts, media, and PTSD wasn't easy. He was exhausted, but he refused to break. Dan Armstrong no longer lived in Cedar Creek. He'd sold the house where every wall echoed Jenna's shadow, where every window held a suspended piece of the past. Now he lived in a small cabin by a lake near Manitowish Waters. No fancy life, just timber walls, howling winter winds, and a rocky shoreline where he'd sit for hours, staring at the water. The hands that once built rooftops now painted old wooden benches. Dan had started a small business, Northline Restorations, repairing and remodeling old cabins, boat docks, and lakeside homes. Locals saw him as calm, professional, and a little mysterious. No one asked about his past, and he never offered it. But every night, When the lake's surface turned to glass and only the rustle of leaves filled the air, Dan would take a small pendant from his pocket, the one with the 3 overlapping circles. It was no longer just a memory. It was a monument. One day, at a local bookstore, Dan met Carrie, a 38-year-old woman who had recently moved to town with her son. Carrie was a school psychologist, working with children dealing with domestic abuse and trauma. Her eyes held fatigue, but her smile was free of performance. Dan felt something in Carrie he hadn't felt in Jenna for years. Realness. She knew people broke, and she wasn't looking for someone to complete her, just someone who wouldn't hate her for the pieces. Their conversation started with books, slowly moved to a corner booth at a coffee shop, where for the first time, Dan shared a piece of his story. "They erase people, Carrie," he said. "They give them new names, new wants, new voices. And people like me, the ones who remember them, we become ghosts with beating hearts." Carrie took his hand. "But you exposed them, Dan. You tried to bring those voices back. That's not a loss. That's resistance." Jake had rebuilt his life too. He now worked in Milwaukee as a security consultant, training organizations on workplace surveillance ethics. After divorcing Lisa, he'd struggled to trust himself again. But his friendship with Dan had only deepened. Every week they spoke on the phone, sometimes in silence, sometimes remembering old days. After Marcus's death, his family retreated from public life. But Dan began sending them a handwritten letter every year. "His sacrifice won't ever get a statue, but we won't forget him." Jenna was now in a monitored trauma facility in California. Her name, identity, and life wrapped beneath layers of therapy. Dan had written to her once, "What you lost inside may never return. But what remains, treat that as freedom, not punishment." I don't blame you. I blame the silence that came between us. There was no reply. Spencer submitted his documentary for an Emmy nomination, and soon received a book deal titled Erased: The Hidden Market of Obedience. Dan occasionally attended public forums, safe circles organized for cult trauma survivors. He didn't teach anything. He just listened. And when he spoke, he said only this: "You are not what they turned you into. You are what's speaking right now." One day, Carrie asked him, "Would you ever consider getting married again?" Dan paused, then replied, "I want to believe again. If that happens, marriage will follow on its own." Carrie smiled. "Fair enough." That same evening, Dan finished work on a new roof for an elderly couple whose marriage had lasted 50 years. When they asked Dan what he wanted from his future, he said, "To build a roof that never buckles, something I never managed in my own life." And for the first time, Dan smiled. The morning light on the lake wasn't a new beginning for Dan Armstrong. It was a cautious awakening. Life had taught him lessons that weren't poetic or cinematic. They were raw, true, and always alert. He'd learned that the real danger isn't what stares you in the face. It's what hides around you for years, slowly seeping in through the cracks of your own roof. Dan's new life was stable, but stability often brought its own kind of emptiness. His bond with Carrie was real and slow. Both of them knew how to live with their scars. But there was still a part of Dan that looked over his shoulder now and then, just to check if the threat had truly ended. And then one night, it all stirred again. Inside Dan's mailbox was a white envelope. No address, no stamp. He opened it. A photo slipped out, faded, blurred. But it was Marcus, only the name printed below was different. Elias Vorn. Underneath it, one line. "Phase 4 begins when the forgotten start to remember." Dan's breath caught. Was Marcus alive? Or was this just the start of a new cycle? That same week, Spencer's website was hacked. His jonquil expose went offline for several hours. When it returned, key footage was missing. Spencer called Dan. "We hit something deeper, Dan. I think we only scratched their public skin." Until now, Dan had believed they'd damaged the core of Jonquil Circle. But now he was certain. What they'd seen was just one regional cell, a test module. The real structure was far bigger, layered, decentralized, and globally spread. Jake called next. "Did you see the news?" Dan hadn't. There was a raid at a wellness resort in Denver, called Aurora Rebirth. Same circle symbol. Dan's reply was simple. They're rebuilding. For Dan, this was no longer personal. It was a decision to stand against a system, one that preyed on exhaustion, broken homes, and emotional vacancy, and turned people into puppets. Dan spoke to Carrie. "I have to go back in, this time deeper." Carrie took a moment, then said, "If you fight, I won't wait. I'll go with you." Dan knew. Carrie had her own trauma. She'd seen the same vacant look in children's eyes that he once saw in Jenna's. Maybe that's why she understood his silence so well. Dan put Northline Restorations on hold and formed a discreet task group with Spencer, Jake, and a few trusted investigative contacts. They called it the Roofline Initiative, tracking Jonquil's new cells, rescuing survivors, building strategies to expose the real masterminds. He wasn't fixing rooftops anymore. He was reinforcing the foundation of society itself. But as he did all this, Dan made one quiet promise to himself. "I will never let myself be erased." One afternoon, while hammering the final nail into a new roof by the lake, he heard a voice behind him. Childlike, bright. "Hey, Mr. Armstrong, that thing looks sturdy." Dan turned. It was Miles, Carrie's son. Dan smiled. "Yeah, this one's not going anywhere." That smile wasn't just a facial gesture. It was an oath that no matter the conspiracies, the silences, or the nights, if even one man chooses to stand, the world's most dangerous machine will tremble. Dan wasn't just a man who survived betrayal. He had become a wall, standing between the innocent and the darkness that was already on its way back. The end.